Pessoal, estou aqui para dar uma notícia para vocês que não sei se vocês estavam esperando a live com o professor Marco, o professor Walter, mas ela vai acontecer. Eles estão aqui, já vão entrar online comigo aqui. Eu só entrei um pouquinho antes aqui para dar aquele olá para vocês, né, agradecer a todo mundo que está nos acompanhando, pedir para vocês se inscreverem aqui no canal, né, essa live super especial aí para vocês depois acompanharem. E, bom, dá tempo ainda de mandar uma mensagem, né, para aqueles colegas que querem acompanhar um pouquinho esse bate-papo de hoje, que vai ser bastante especial. Acho que todo mundo vai gostar muito. A expectativa é grande, né? Durante a fala, vocês podem também mandar mensagens aqui no chat. Eu vou traduzir algumas partes da conversação no chat também, para aqueles que às vezes não pegarem a tradução. Eu vou tentar ali aos pouquinhos, claro, não tudo, né? Mas algumas mensagens. Então... Hi, Marco. Hi, Walter. Well, first of all,
Hello.
welcome.
Hello.
To the Neuromech TV. This is a very special day to have you two guys here. So how is it going?
Really good, thank you.
Very well, thank you.
So yeah, today we are here to talk about not science as you are aware. I mean, not about papers and that stuff. This is to the other lives. So here is to talk about the scientist life and to learn a bit more about the history and the experience of Professor Walter Herzog. That I think everybody here knows him. He's a very, very, very important scientist in the field. But today we're not going to talk about science exactly. Of course, right, Mark? So what is the main goal of tonight?
Well, our main goal is this one. Usually when we talk about a scientist, people think that the scientist is not a human being. He is a neutral person. He doesn't have a life. He writes papers. He's very, absent from all the problems that happen in society. And he's well known by all the papers and books that he has written. And by reading some history of science books, we can see that that's not actually correct. So scientists are just human beings as we are. They go through the same problems. They have several doubts. They have questions. They have a challenge in their lives. And the idea then is that tonight we can chat with Walter and then, get to know him not just as a scientist, but mostly as a human being. So that's our idea. So, and most people know Walter exactly by his papers. But
well,
for
now
me,
Walter looks like a bit scary now.
For me,
I am a bit scared. Yes.
For me, it means that they don't know him. I think I know him a little bit better than most people do. I know Walter for 28 years, so, and we have had a good journey walking together for some periods of time in my academic life and my personal life as well. So, and I think it would be nice exactly that people get to know a little bit of Walter Herzog as a person and not necessarily as a scientist. And I think it's important mainly for the students, because sometimes the students, they kind of look at a scientist or a person like something that is intangible, some person that is completely away in a different world. And the idea is that we can show them that, no, a scientist is a real human being and has similar problems as all of them are passing through, for example, right now. So that's the main theme of our talk today.
So I know you have some questions to Walter, Marco, but before, Walter, how are you going now with the pandemic period? Where are you now? Are you in Canada? Are you in Brazil? Where are you?
I'm actually in Brazil. I'm in Florianopolis. I am on a sabbatical leave for the year, so I came to Florianopolis in the middle of January, and have been working at UFSC here at the Federal University Santa Catarina till the end of March. And then, of course, classes were cancelled and the university is not accessible anymore since then. but I'm still working with a couple of students, with a couple of faculty members, writing papers, writing a book, doing things. Yes, but I'll be here till the end of the year. So till middle of December, I'll be in Brazil.
Great. So Marco, let's start.
Okay, so let's start. All right, we did chat a little bit, Walter, sometimes about you. Well, not very often, but from time to time, you give small little pieces about your childhood. And so I wanted you to explain a little bit, how was your childhood in Switzerland? How was it? Which are the main memories that you have, and which you think were the important things that drove you to your journey to academia?
Okay. I want to tell first everybody that Marco did not let me know what kind of questions he would ask me. So I sometimes might have to think a second about what I'm going to answer here. But childhood should be fairly easy. So I grew up in a small farming town of about 2,000 people in Switzerland, and my parents were living there, and also most of my family on my mother's side, so my maternal grandmother and grandfather and all my uncles and aunts on that side were living in the same little village. So we were a fairly connected family. I went to school there for elementary school and then also for junior high school, which is 9 years in Switzerland. And then when I went to high school, I had to take the bus every day at 6:45 in the morning because high school was about 40 kilometers away. Our village was too small to have a high school. So then I went to this town about 40 kilometers away at 6:45 in the morning, and then came home usually about 6:30 in the evening for high school. And I'm not really sure what influenced me to go into science. I did not really think about science. Both my parents did not finish elementary school. My mother was taken out of school in grade 6 because she had to work on the farm. They said, "You're old enough now." When she was about 11 or 12, then her parents took her out of school. And my father as well was taken out of school in grade 6. So both of my parents did not even complete their elementary school education. And so I grew up essentially not really discussing academic things around the table or so. I discussed a lot about sports with my father, who was a sports fanatic, and talked a lot about stories and books with my mother, because my mother was a very avid reader. And but then after junior high school was done, I was not sure exactly what to do. And then based on my older sister, so I should probably go back here. I have 3 older siblings and 3 younger siblings. So I'm 1 out of 7, right in the middle. And my oldest sister is 9 years older than me. And she then told me, rather than going in and doing an apprenticeship, that, I seem to be clever. Maybe I should go to high school in this remote town. And that's what I did. And when I went to high school, I decided after high school I wanted to go to university and become a physical education teacher. And then I studied physical education. And then about 2 years into those studies, I got exposed to biomechanics, really liked it, wanted to study it, and realized that you could not study biomechanics in Switzerland. There was no graduate level studies at the time. And so I knew that I had to go away. And that's when I decided to leave Switzerland. So when I was 23 years old, I went to the United States. to study biomechanics with Jim Hay, and I guess that finished kind of my my education and my childhood and my being in Switzerland.
Okay, so you partly answer my second question, because it was about sports. You mentioned about sports, and then I was going to ask you why you decided to go to physical education. Was it because of your relationship with your father, that you liked sports and then you were into sports? And which kind of sports did you practice in Switzerland as you grew up?
Yeah. As I grew up, I always did a little bit of track and field, because, you know, in my little village, 2,000 people, there's not really that much competition. And I very quickly realized that I was the fastest runner. I realized that in grade 1, when I was 6 years old, that I could outrun everybody my age, and sometimes even boys and girls that were a couple of years older. So I realized fairly quickly that I was a good runner. And then until I was about 14, I also played soccer. I also played team handball, and then for a while, my father was very much into cycling. He wanted me to be a cyclist, and so I guess because of my father, I also cycled until I was about 13 or 14 years old. And I'm very proud to say that every race I entered in cycling, I won. But then when I was about 13 or 14, I realized that people started to use group tactics to potentially prevent somebody from winning. And I realized that cycling became a group sport, team sport. And that didn't really fit me very well. And so when I was about 14, I stopped playing soccer, I stopped cycling, and then I started primarily running. Yeah, so I did track and field and running.
Okay, and so when you went to the university, then track and field was like, let's say, what you thought you were going to be, like a teacher of track and field, or was that the original plan?
Yeah, that was not only the original plan, that was also the plan when I left for the United States to get my PhD. So as I said, in about the middle of my undergraduate studies in physical education, I thought I wanted to study biomechanics, but I didn't want to study biomechanics to be a scientist. I wanted to study biomechanics because I wanted to be a well-educated coach. And I had worked a little bit and coached a little bit track and field in Switzerland, and I knew and had worked with a national team coach, and he essentially promised me a position after my PhD if I came back, that I could go and work as a national team coach in track and field in Switzerland. And so when I went to the United States to study, the idea was, okay, I go there for 4 years, I get my PhD, I come back, and then I'm going to be a national team coach. So that was really the plan.
And then what changed? Because I think that if we look at your thesis to your PhD, it's not related to sports biomechanics, right? Although Jim Hay was one of the, we could say that he was one of the best biomechanists in sports biomechanics in the last century, right?
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that he probably was the best sport biomechanist of the 20th century, and I learned an enormous amount from him. He was an incredibly tough, but also an incredibly knowledgeable teacher, and I really learned how to do research with Jim Hay. In my previous education, I didn't really know what research was, and I was not one of these people that naturally knew how it worked, and so I learned a lot from him. And I was primarily working with Jim Hay, also in track and field, in long jump and triple jump, and also in swimming, the swimming research he did. And but I remember very distinctly, in about 1982, Jim Hay had this funding from the American Track and Field Association to prepare the long jumpers and the triple jumpers for the Olympic Games in 1984, which were to be in Los Angeles, so in the United States. And so we were looking at all these athletes, and one of these athletes was Carl Lewis, who won, as some of you might know, won 4 gold medals at Olympic Games, won the gold medal in long jump and then many other medals in sprinting as well. So we were working with Carl Lewis and we tried to figure out why he didn't break the world record, because we thought he had all the abilities that he should be able to break the world record, but he never did. And I remember very distinctly at one point, Jim Hay asked me, so how can we make it that Carl Lewis is breaking the world record? And my answer was, well, maybe we should try to figure out how somebody with the muscles and the capacity and the speed of Carl Lewis, how we can maximize his jumping ability. And so all of a sudden I realized I was actually not interested in the athlete anymore, but I was interested in the question, how can you maximize jumping performance when you're given a certain initial condition? And then that was in about the middle of my PhD studies, and then I realized that I was less and less interested in the athlete and more in the question of, you know, how can you jump far and what do the muscles do and how do the muscles contribute to that? And I think that's when I started realizing that I'm probably not going to be a coach, that I probably like science better than coaching.
Okay, about this time during your, let's talk first about your undergraduate time and then your graduate time. Which were the biggest challenges that you had, first as an undergraduate student and then after as a graduate student?
The biggest challenge as an undergraduate student was that I failed my figure skating exam in the first semester. And in Switzerland, in physical education, you're only allowed to fail one subject. Otherwise, you're not going to get your physical education degree. And so here I had 4 years of study and probably about 32 practical subjects, and I failed the very first one. So I knew that the other 31 of them I had to pass. And although I knew like swimming and track and field and soccer and volleyball and all those would be very, very easy, but there were a couple that I knew would be really hard for me, like gymnastics. You know, I'm 1.93 meters tall, and at the time was a runner. I was 74 kilos, so I was long and lanky and not very strong. And so I was a bit worried about not passing my gymnastics exam either. So that was the biggest challenge. So making sure I would pass the practical exams that were part of the education. So so if I had failed another exam, I would never have gotten the degree. I would never have been you know, here. So, but anyway, long story short, I passed the other exams. And then also as an undergraduate student, I got exposed to biomechanics that really fascinated me. And that was in the laboratory of Benno Neg at the time, but I actually did not work with Benno Neg. I was working with a person that most of you probably have never heard of. His name was Yachin Denot. And I did my kind of diploma work or master's thesis with him on running and different running styles, forefoot and rear foot running, which then 20 or 25 years later became very prominent again. And he was a fantastic teacher, and he really captured my imagination, and I really started liking biomechanics because of Yachin Denot, my professor there at the time, who supervised me in my research work. And that's when I decided I wanted to do that. That's when I decided I wanted to study biomechanics and learn more about it. And then you say biggest challenges in my graduate studies?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the biggest challenge, I think, in my graduate studies was money, because in Switzerland, like in Brazil, education is free. And in Switzerland, public schools are free, and public schools are by far the best. And so everybody goes to public schools, and it doesn't cost anything. And I didn't fully realize that when I went to the United States, that I had to pay about, at the time, about $5,000 of tuition. And this is 1979. So that's probably about twice as much in today's money. And I had a little bit of savings, but not nearly enough to get me through my graduate studies. And so I worked then. I asked Jim Hay to work as a research assistant for him. And so for my entire time in Iowa City at the University of Iowa with Jim Hay, I did actually research assistant work for him to be paid so that I could pay my school fees. And so I always tell people I worked during the day for Jim Hay as a research assistant, and then I got my PhD after dinner. So from 7 till 10, that's when I did my PhD work. So I kind of always feel I literally worked all day and then in the evening did my research work, did my class work that I had to do and those type of things. So really the financial aspect was a very big challenge because my parents were not in a position to support me, and even if they were, I probably wouldn't have allowed them to do that. So that was a big challenge, and that's why it also took me a little bit longer to get my PhD than it normally would probably.
Okay, then from your PhD, you finished your PhD in Iowa, and then you got a postdoc position, I think was in Calgary. Is that correct?
Yeah, then after that, I got a postdoc position, and not only that, there were a couple of job offers waiting for me, and a couple of postdocs that were offered to me. So the interesting thing in 1985 was, if you had a PhD in biomechanics, people would try to hire you before you were actually done. And a colleague of mine who was at about the same level with me, he actually was hired by the University of Denver about a year before he was done, and I could have done the same. So those were brilliant times where researchers in biomechanics were hired before they got a PhD. But I felt I wasn't really ready to be a professor. And so I very deliberately decided to do a postdoc. And out of Jim Hay's lab, I was the very first person to do a postdoc. And Jim Hay was in Iowa from about 1968 on, and I graduated in 1985. So he had been there for about 17 years, and none of his previous students had ever done a postdoc because it was just not required. And as I said, I just did it because I felt I wasn't ready to teach and be a scientist and that type of stuff. I didn't feel I was an adult researcher yet. So then I had an offer to go to Calgary with Benno Nick, and I also had an offer to go to the University of California in Los Angeles with Bob Greger, and actually had almost committed to go to Bob Greger because they did certain work there that I wanted to do. So I had a very precise goal, what I wanted to learn during my postdoc. And they were doing that in Los Angeles. And then at one point, Dr. Nig called me up and said, oh, we have a person who does actually that type of work here as well. And that was a person called Andy Hoffer, who was in clinical neuroscience. And he also did exactly the type of work that I wanted to learn. And then I decided, because I knew Benno Nick from Zurich, and they had this ability there, the potential there for me to learn what I wanted to learn. So that's when I went to Calgary. That's when I decided to go to Calgary. Yeah.
Okay. And then, but at that point in time as well, you started working in a different field as well, right? Like the chiropractic area. Isn't that correct? That you also started working in this area? And why is that?
So some of you might know that we have done some chiropractic work, particularly as it relates to neck manipulation and the safety of neck manipulation with chiropractors. And the reason why I got into that was because Benno Nick, for my support, for my financial support, had organized work with a chiropractic organization, that's the College of Chiropractors of Alberta. So he organized, he organized money from them to support my salary in exchange that I would spend a certain amount of my time on doing back-related research. There was really no mandate what I had to do, but a certain amount of time had to be done on back-related research that would be of interest to chiropractors. And so really the reason why I did that initially was because they funded my salary and my postdoctoral fellowship in Calgary. And maybe at this time I should emphasize that over the many years, so I've been there now 35 years, and over the 35 years, the chiropractic community every year continuously has given me a little bit amount of money for doing that type of work. So they are the only organization in my career that has supported me every year from the very beginning to now, and hopefully to the very end. So yeah.
Well, that's interesting because you're very well known in the area. Even here in Brazil, I went to one of the congress. I was invited to one of the congress, and I prepared a little, presentation where I showed a little bit what I was a subject in some of the projects when I was doing my PhD with you, with one of the chiropractors. So it was interesting because the second person that was giving the talk gave a very similar talk as I did, using the work that you did in Calgary to show, chiropractors in Brazil. So you're well known in Brazil too because of that work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was once invited, actually here in Florianopolis, about 2 or 3 years ago, by the Brazilian Chiropractic Association to give a keynote lecture. Yes, and it was a bit lucky that we got fairly famous in the chiropractic community, and sometimes I guess you need to have a little bit luck. But I had a graduate student who was a chiropractor, and his name was Bruce Simons. That must have been in about 1998 or 1999. And he was interested in looking at the forces exerted by chiropractors when chiropractors, manipulate the neck area, the cervical spine. And he was particularly interested in that because he wanted to see how much stress and strain would be on the vertebral artery when you did these chiropractic manipulations. And as we were doing that work and as we were publishing the first work, a woman in Saskatchewan in Canada died on a chiropractic table right following a chiropractic manipulation because of a torn vertebral artery. And nobody in the entire world had any information on the biomechanics of spinal manipulation of the neck or on the stresses and strain on the vertebral artery, except for us. And so when that happened one day, the next day we had like 4 or 5 different camera crews from different TV stations and radio stations, all in the laboratory, and they wanted to know all about it. And then, of course, there was a legal case, and we got involved in a legal case. And so from there on, it really snowballed in the sense that that people all of a sudden became very, very interested in that type of work. And all of a sudden, people started to cite that work really heavily. And we have continued very similar work ever since. But it was a little bit, bad news, obviously, for the chiropractic community that this accident happened, but it made us very, very prominent because we had, by accident, studied something that all of a sudden the whole world was interested in.
Okay, so in addition to this chiropractic work, then you mentioned that you started working with muscles, right? And then with cartilage as well. Osteoarthritis is another big field in your career. So could you comment a little bit on each one of these 2 areas?
Sure. Yeah, muscles really goes back to my PhD work because, as I mentioned, when we did work with the track and field athletes and the swimmers, I was interested in how the muscles worked and what kind of properties they had. And my PhD work then was on the distribution problem a purely theoretical piece of work where I tried to figure out how much force does each muscle carry during certain movements, human movements. And it was purely theoretical work. And then for my postdoc, I wanted to figure out whether or not my theoretical work was any valid. And so I needed to be able to measure directly muscle forces in multiple muscles during movement. And since measuring direct muscle forces in human movement is essentially impossible, I went to an animal model, and that's why I went to Calgary. And I was saying, you know, I knew exactly what I wanted to do for my postdoc. I wanted to learn the techniques of how you could measure individual muscle forces in an animal model, have that animal walk and jump and do whatever that animal does, and then measure the forces simultaneously and see whether or not my theoretical approach that I got my PhD for would actually work. And the good news is I got a PhD for that work. The bad news is it actually didn't work at all. My predictions from my PhD work were not very good at all and couldn't really predict very accurately at all what the individual measured muscle forces were. But the other good news is, to this day, 35 years later, nobody actually has really found a way to predict individual muscle forces really, really well. So although I didn't succeed in the intermediate 35 years, nobody else has actually really come up with a very good solution for that either. But what I realized is that my predictions didn't work because I didn't really know enough about muscles. And that's when I got interested in the muscle properties, force length property, force velocity property, history-dependent properties, and so on. And that's when we started doing in human work and isolated muscle work and isolated fiber work. That's when we started exploring just basic properties of skeletal muscle. And then at one point, I stumbled over these history-dependent properties, and I tried to model that with the cross-pitch model, and I realized fairly quickly that this property is not represented at all in the cross-bridge theory or the basic textbook way of how we think how muscles contract. And then all of a sudden, I said, okay, I would like to figure out how that works. And that's when I, realized I need to go on the molecular level, on the cellular level, on the myofibrillar level, on the isolated sarcomere level to really figure that out. But the whole muscle work really started with my PhD, even though that was purely theoretical, but it all snowballed from there. The articular cartilage work and the osteoarthritis is a bit different, because we then developed this technique where we could measure muscle forces in animal models fairly well. And in about 1992 or 1993, so when I was in Calgary for about 8 years, an orthopedic surgeon whose name was Cy Frank approached me and he said, you have a really good model here. You can measure all these muscle forces. And in osteoarthritis, people are interested what happens to the muscle forces, or when you lose the anterior cruciate ligament, or when you have a meniscal injury, people are interested what happens to the muscle forces. And so what I did then is I wrote in 1993 or 1994, I wrote a grant to the Arthritis Society where we said, okay, we are going to have this animal model where we take the anterior cruciate ligament out and we see what happens to the muscle, how they react, and how the progression of osteoarthritis is in this animal model. And we also sent the same grant application to the Canadian Institute of Health Research with a slight variation, but then instantaneously we got both of these funded. And that was much, much more research money than I ever had in my life. I think my research money like quadrupled within like 10 days when I got both grants. And then all of a sudden we had to do this work because I was describing to these granting agencies that we wanted to do that. And that's really how it came about. So I was not really interested in osteoarthritis. I was not really interested in cartilage, but this colleague of mine said, you have a really good model here. You should take advantage of that in another area rather than just muscles, and that's what I did. And that ended up being incredibly successful right away, and there it goes.
Okay, let's change a little bit the subject now.
Sure.
In the history of science, most scientists were very religious. And why were they religious? Because they wanted to find God through their experiments. So they wanted to explain human nature, trying to understand how humans were dependent on God. So I would like to know, what is your vision about the universe? How do you see us human beings in this planet Earth, around the universe? And how do you see religion in this respect? As we usually think that religion and science are two things that are completely opposite, but we learn from history that many of the scientists that we read the books and that we learn about experiments, they were very religious people, and they were trying to understand God and not actually looking for answers in science. So it's kind of interesting that it's so different from what we were taught in school, for example. So yeah. How do you see this?
I want to repeat, maybe I said it, I want to repeat that I didn't know what kind of questions Marco is asking me. So if I'm struggling a little bit with questions, please excuse me. But with religion and science, I like to quote Einstein, who was asked once a very similar question. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but he essentially said, I have absolutely no problem believing in God and at the same time do science, because for me, science is what I can see and feel and sense with my organs, with my sensory organs. And in that sense, it is a reality, whereas God and religion is a belief system. And to me, these are two completely independent things, and one doesn't exclude the other. So for him, that was not really a problem. I had once, about 20 years ago, I had a very religious student, a Muslim student from Iran. And shortly before he left the lab, he said, what is your religion? You must be a very religious person. And I said, well, I was raised Catholic, but I'm not really, I don't really think I'm a religious person. And then he said, but you must believe in something, just the way you are and the way you live and that type of thing. And I said, well, if you ask me if there is a human-like, all-knowing figure that lives in the heavens and looks after us and determines how our lives go and make sure that we are safe on this planet, then I probably cannot believe that. But if you ask me if God is some kind of a law of nature that brings things into an order and obeys certain rules, that has allowed evolution to occur and human beings and animals to evolve from single cell kind of constructs, then yes, I believe very, very much that there is a driving force who does that. And if you want to call that driving force God, then yes, I would believe in a God, in a higher power, in laws of nature that make certain things happen that are very, very hard, I think, for us humans to understand.
It's interesting because when I was an undergraduate student, my first supervisor, he was an anatomy professor, and we had what we call the academic week in our faculty. It's usually in October, but at that point in time was in July. And then we had a week where we were exposed to so many different things about religion, nutrition, yoga, science. It was kind of a very interesting thing. And But the most important thing for me was that his first words on the start of that week, he went to the blackboard and then he just draw, you know, an horizontal line. And then he put science in the bottom, and then he put religion on the top. And he said, whatever we can explain, we call it science. So it's down to earth. Whatever we cannot explain, we have to believe. So it's kind of outside of our reach. So it's in the top. Whatever you do in life, you have to walk with both. So both are going to accompany you. Doesn't matter whatever you believe, but you probably believe or in something. Doesn't mean that you believe in God, but science and religion have accompanied human beings from the beginning. As a species, we were able to survive because groups of humans believed in something, and then they fought together because they had this belief. And I think that that's the origin of religion itself, is when we started as groups to survive, and survival was what, you know, the belief in something was what made survival possible in our beginning as a human species. But yeah, okay. I have my two last questions for you now, Walter. Then
let me make just an additional comment to religion. One thing that I believe is that as human beings, we are very, very curious about where we came from. And we are very, very curious where we are going when we are dead, when we die. And I think as long as we cannot answer these questions, religion will always be there, because we do need, and some people need it more and some less, and some believe in one thing and another. But I think most of us have a certain belief of where we came from and where we are going when this life is done. And so I think as long as that exists, there will be religion.
Okay, so my last two questions are a little bit on this direction, like regarding the future then. What else you want to achieve as a scientist and as a human being?
Oh, the question as a scientist is very easy. The question as a human being, that's a very big question, and I'm not really sure if I can answer that. But as a scientist, this seems like a very teeny tiny thing and very unimportant, and it probably is. But we were among the very, very first ones in skeletal muscle to identify that this filamentous protein, the structural protein titin, plays a certain role in muscle contraction. And I would love to figure out exactly what that protein does and how it works and how it functions. And I know that's such a tiny, teeny little stupid thing, but I would absolutely love that if I could figure out and write a last paper that says, this is how it is, and that's how it works, and it's proven, and it's all good, and it's all solved. So that became my dream in science. As a human being, it's that's a very tough question. You know, I have 3 kids and now recently a grandkid, and I think I would just like to look after the people that are close in my life and make sure that they're well taken care of, and be, you know, as good an example and as good a father or a grandfather or a husband or as I can be. And so I don't really see myself as making big changes to the world or to society. I'm really much more focused on a very close family type of a circle of people that I hope I can give something that makes life easier for them, or that I can be there when they need me. My sister told me once, many years ago, when her kids were little, she told me once that she felt being a mother is like being a net in a circus, and you have these trapeze artists, and your children are the trapeze artists. And when they lose balance or lose grip and fall down, then you are the net who captures them so that they land safely and can go back up again to the trapeze. And I think that's a little bit how I feel, that the people around me, I want them to feel that I'm there when it's needed, and I'm also not there when it's not needed. So, but I have to say, I don't think as a human being I'll be changing society. I'll never be a president or an important figure that makes a big impact, I think, on the world.
Well, you have made a big impact in the world. You have, developed biomechanics worldwide, and you are probably the most well-known biomechanist that I have ever seen. So I think that's an achievement from the work that you did over all these years. And that's not just me saying. You can ask anybody in the world who is Walter Herzog, and they heard about you. So I think you have done already the steps. So.
And and that's another thing that I'm very proud of is the students of mine and postdocs of mine that have gone out into the world and have done good things, and maybe this is a good point to mention Antonio Guimaraes, who was my very first PhD student, and then went back to Brazil and just did great things for Brazilian biomechanics, and I'm so proud of that. I'm so proud that he was one of the leaders of the very early biomechanics science in this country, and there is other examples from other countries and other people that do good science and do good things for their communities that were students in the lab, and I'm very proud of that.
So Walter, having gone through so many things over your life, as an undergraduate student, as a graduate student, you have seen that technology has changed so much. So many things changed over the years. Science changed over the years. So if you are, as a scientist, now you go back and you look at all the things that have happened throughout your life, and now let's say that you have to guess what would happen 100 years from now. What do you think it's going to happen as us as human beings and science? So which would be your guesses? That's what I want to hear. Which would be your guesses?
What science is going to be in 100 years from now?
Yeah, and society.
And society. Oh, that's a very tough question. While I'm thinking about that, I'm gonna tell a little story, because you mentioned technological advantage and how that has changed. And let me tell a little story as I'm thinking about the other question. A few years ago, I was invited with the late Paavo Komi, who most of you might know as well. And we were asked by students about our initial lives. And of course, Paavo is about 17 or 18 years older than me. So he was one of the very, very early people. And he told this story where he came to the United States. In fact, he came to the University of Iowa in Iowa City because he thought there was an electromyographical system there, an EMG system, but there wasn't. And then he had to go to Penn State, and this is 1965, because the only electromyographical system in the entire of the United States was at Penn State University. So now all of us have about 3 or 4 different EMG systems in our own lab, in our own group. And that's how things have evolved, that in 1965, there was one EMG system in the entire United States. That always gives me a little bit to think. But 100 years from now, you know, Marco, I think that's almost impossible to predict. I know that at least one of my children has a very somber view of what's going to happen in 100 years with all the pollution and global warming and all that. I tend to be more optimistic. I hope that humanity will be still humanity. I've read recently a couple of books on the collapse of humanity, where essentially the prediction was that in about 40 years from now, humans would essentially become pets of technology, and everything, all the inventions, all the thinking, all the exploration, all the science would be done automatically by very sophisticated computers. And we essentially, human beings, we would be like cows or dogs or cats. We would just be not really having to do anything because everything would be taken care of by technology. And I very much hope that that's not going to be the case. I very much hope that not in 40 years, like they predict, also in 100 years from now, there will still be, you know, human beings that have a say about how the world should run, and that human intelligent intuition and the brain will still be worth something. Although we have to admit that computers have just a completely different capacity than our brains have, and are infinitely faster than our brains are. So, but there is a certain element that I would call humanity that I do hope will still be there in 100 years and in 1,000 years. But it's going to be really, really hard to predict with the technological advances, I think, how the world is going to look like. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions I had for you, but I know that lots of people have questions with Felipe there. So Felipe, it's with you now.
Yeah, we have some questions from the live chat. So one question is, what was the professional goal did you reach that had more, well, that made you more satisfied so far?
Yeah. If you ask, if the question is what my professional goal was when I started out in this business, then by accident I have achieved much more than I ever set out, because when I went to the University of Calgary, I always thought that I would go away from there and I would go to a relatively small school, have 2 or 3 graduate students, have 1 grant, and do a little bit muscle research. And you know, now my group is 25 or 30 people, and you know, multiple grants and lots of science going on at any given instant in time. So I found it really interesting how the way I thought I would be as a scientist, a relative loner with a relatively small lab with a couple of graduate students, that did not happen, and maybe in another life it will at one point. So I think it's really funny to say, but I never really had any goals, any professional goals. You know, I never had. You know, I've won several, you know, prizes for the research and awards for my research, and so. But to me, I never had a goal to do that. For me, it was always just trying to figure out how things work, trying to do good science, do it carefully, and then things just fell into place, you know, without really me having those type of goals. But as I said, I would like to figure out how this myofilament titan works. That is still my goal.
Nice. Well, there's another question that you kind of answered already. Maybe you can provide some further comments. it's related to your career. What is the general reflection you do about your career, and what could you, well, what legacy do you consider you leave for biomechanics?
Yeah, I think the second question, you know, what legacy you leave, I think I would leave that up for others to decide rather than me deciding what my legacy is. I think that's really somebody external that needs to that really needs to do that. But about my career and reflections on my career, I find it really interesting how I came from a family where none of my 6 siblings studied. My parents, as I said, didn't have an education, didn't finish their elementary school education. So I grew up in a really non-academic environment, and somehow I ended up becoming an academic, and I ended up becoming a scientist. And sometimes I look back how I was as a little kid, and I see features of where I approached certain things, even as a little kid, very, very systematically. And I remember very distinctly in grade 1, 2, and 3, very early on in elementary school, where I challenged my teachers and said, I don't think you're right, you know, to my teachers as an elementary school kid. And so somehow I was born with a critical mind, and somehow I was born with a certain curiosity that led me into this scientific career, despite the fact that growing up where I grew up and growing up in the family that I grew up, I really should not have become an academic. I should have become a farmer.
Another question is, would you have any advice to help people to thrive on the academic system that's still based in the number of papers mostly?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I'm not sure what the good answer there is, but the one thing that I have realized as I've been in Brazil is that a lot of the work that people are doing is evaluated by how many papers they write, in which journal, and what impact factor the journals have, and how the journals are ranked. And you know, working at UFSC, at least for the first 3 months there, I also became aware how accountable academics are. You know, you have to, people at UFSC at least seem to have to justify continuously to their departmental colleagues exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it and all those type of things. And I personally think that is not such a good system. I think it would be much better to see, you know, what kind of an impact a person has on in science. So for example, rather than publishing a paper in a high impact journal, I think it would be much more important to see, is that paper referred to? Is that paper cited? Are people working with the work and with the results that you produced? But I know you are in this particular system, but I've always been a little of a rebel, and whenever I was forced into a system and I didn't quite like it or it didn't quite fit me, then I always said, well, forget about the system. I just do what I want to do. I try to do it really well, and I try to do it in an accountable way for myself. And usually for me, at least, that has worked out. I'm not sure if that's good advice in the Brazilian system, but I think, you know, academia should be free, and you should follow your own instincts. And the only responsibility you have in academia, I think, is that it has to be excellent. You know, when you work in business, then very often you do things just fit for purpose. You just do them, they're done, and that's it. But in academia, you have a certain responsibility that you want to do your stuff really carefully, and you want it to be excellent. And once you do that, I wouldn't worry too much about all the other things.
and following the same discussion, but now considering the undergrad students, what advice or what do you consider important for an undergrad student to be an acknowledged scholar like you?
Well, that's a question for Ron. I know Ron. He's Radowski. So I think as an undergraduate student, getting involved as much as you can in science is a very first step that I think is really good. And if you feel that science is your calling and that you love science, get involved in a variety of different things and see what grabs you and what interests you, and just get involved in as much as you can. And then once you're done with your undergraduate studies, then my advice when people go into a master's degree or into a PhD, when you go to graduate studies, look for a really good supervisor. Look for a supervisor that really fits you, and look for a supervisor that who does really exciting work that you are excited about as well. And once you do that, then you're home free.
I'm following here the other questions.
Sure, yeah.
So how did your family react to this academic journey that you have started? Did they support you? Did they understand your goals, your career?
Yeah. My parents always let me do whatever I wanted to do. So I grew up in a family where, you know, if I wanted to study and so on, then it was all up to me. But when I decided, you know, in 1974, when I went to high school in Switzerland, most people, that means 90% of the people, would do an apprenticeship. So they would not go to high school, they would not go to university. And even today, only about 11% of the Swiss people go to university. So most of the education in Switzerland is done as an apprenticeship. So for example, even if you want to be an engineer or a teacher, you don't go to university. If you want to be an engineer, a non-academic engineer, you go at 15 years old, after your junior high school, you go to an engineering firm, you take about 2 days of school and about 3 days you work practically. And you do that for 4 to 6 years. And then you become an engineer that builds bridges and builds houses and so. So there's a very small percentage of people in Switzerland that go to university and high school. And when I decided to do that in 1974, that I said I'm going to go to high school, my parents were fully supportive, but they said they wouldn't be able to financially support me. And since I didn't do an apprenticeship and didn't earn any money, I didn't have to give money to my parents to live at home like my other siblings who were in an apprenticeship. But at the same time, they would not be able to support me financially. But otherwise, like mentally, and they always stood fully behind me. And my biggest supporter always was my oldest sister, who is 9 years older than me, and she always very, very much encouraged me in my earlier years when I didn't really know what I was doing, to go that way, to go to high school, to do science, to do that. Yeah. So there was very much understanding and support.
We have another one that's maybe it's a good one to be the last question from the chat so far. It's how much do we need to advance in the internationalization of knowledge to advance in the knowledge of the human biology area?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question, because as some of you might know, I'm here at UFSC through the print program that was, you know, designed for internationalization. And you know, when you say how much do we need to advance, you know, my answer is the more the better. You know, I think science is an international endeavor, and it doesn't have any boundaries. It doesn't stop where the limits of Brazil are. They don't stop anywhere. And I think the more you can get internationally involved as an individual, the more Brazilian universities can get internationally involved, the more the biomechanics community gets involved internationally, the better it is, because biomechanics is not in Brazil, it's not in Canada, it's not in the United States, it's around the world. And fortunately, you have some very good leaders with Felipe and Marco, who have gotten very much involved internationally by hosting the International Society of Biomechanics, by hosting the International Society of Biomechanics in Sport, by serving on the executive councils of the International Society of Biomechanics. And those are exactly the type of things that form the community. And my answer is, the more you do for yourself personally, getting internationally involved, and the more your community and your university, your laboratory is doing in that direction, the better it is.
Marco, please go ahead, some comments. I will just show some messages in the screen. They are not questions, but are comments and compliments.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Walter, for the wonderful talk. It's always a pleasure. We have chatted several times over the years, and I think that for me, those were probably the most important moments, in our relationship in these 28 years, because it's when you get to know the person. So it's not just about papers. It's about who you're working with and who is that person. And you have been a real model for me. So it was such a pleasure to follow your steps, and I was really glad that Tony actually guided me to be yours, to be supervised by you. So that was really nice and was very important in my personal and in my academic life. So thank you very much for that. And Felipe,
thank you.
And Felipe, thank you for organizing these these lives. I think it's something that is very important, and it's a unique opportunity that we have. To talk a little bit during this very difficult time, and to meet friends, to learn new things. So it has been a fantastic journey that you have been opportunizing here for the students and for other professors.
No, I thank you, because for me it's pretty easy. I just managing the YouTube here, so it's kind of very easy. I was not able to prepare questions, but I'm always learning from you guys. I remember when I first time met Marco, and when I went to Calgary, first time talking with Walter was like the biggest day of my life. Very nervous. I still have the picture, and well, I'm very happy now, because now we are kind of, I can say we are friends. We went for running one time
in Chile. That's
in
right.
Chile. It's, for me, these memories are very special, and I try to translate all this excitation, let's say, to the students, to show them that everything is possible. Of course, we need opportunity, we need diversity, equality, but we need to work for that. And when we try to motivate people, I think that's fantastic what people can achieve. So it worked for me in the past. So I try to just pass ahead to the others. So it was amazing tonight. And I know a lot of people like the conversation as well. That there's a lot of messages here and trying to manage the show. And yeah, Marco, thank you again for another opportunity that you give me, because so many opportunities in my life. So, and Walter, for your time. I was talking to Walter this week, and I was wondering, he was in Canada and sent no, because it could be 9 here, and then in Calgary it'd be 6. No, I'm in Brazil. Okay.
I'm in Brazil. I'm in Brazil. Yeah. Thank you very much, Felipe. Greatly appreciated for inviting me. Marco, pleasure. Yeah.
Again, it's always a pleasure, Walter.
Yeah, great, fabulous. Yeah, thank you very much.
So this is it, guys. I just show some messages, people from Chile as well. a lot of things, and yeah, congrats. Okay, so thank you everybody for watching this live conversation tonight. The video will be available here forever as long as YouTube exists, so you have the chance to watch again if you want. I know that a lot of people will watch again to learn tough questions for Marco, because people are wondering, Marco, that you work at the question, Marco. So yeah.
He always asks tough questions.
I had a good teacher,
Yeah.
Okay. So, good night, everyone. And you two still don't close the browser. Keep connected. But for those that are watching in YouTube now, we are just finishing now. Just ask Marco and Walter to give a final message, a goodbye message.
Okay, I'll start. I think that the most important thing for the students is to have good examples, as Walter mentioned, finding a person that really, touches you in a specific way that is related to the work that you want to do. So I think that was what made me. I had 3 supervisors. I had 3 important persons in my life. Unfortunately, the first 2 already died, so I'm really glad that Walter is still here. But
Thank you.
I was really unfortunate that they died really young, both of them. And Walter knows, the second one, but they made a big difference in my life, not as a student, but as a human being. So. And I think that's the most important thing I think that people should relate to when they are choosing something in their lives, is that they should get closer to people that can lead them to the goals that they want to achieve. And the second thing is what I think Felipe said: we have to work really hard, and we have to go after our dreams. I always am happy to say that most of the goals that I had in my life, most of the dreams that I had, they became true through hard work. And so I think that's for me, it's that's the way we should go. No matter what are the challenges, we can always find different solutions, and we learn as we go through the problems. We learn as we go through the challenges, and that's how we grow as well as human beings. So these are the most important things. And it was, has been a fantastic journey, walking, besides Walter for so many years, and watching, all the things that he has done, and then, having all the help that he has given me over the years, so that's really nice.
And I'm going to finish up as well here. Yeah, Felipe. Yeah, good. Not much else to say. I think that the one thing that I would like to say, especially to the young people and students in the audience, is that I've seen biomechanics in Brazil come from essentially nowhere in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to being very prominent. I've been at several biomechanics conferences now, and there is, I don't know how many, 500, 600 people, very strong research. And so I'm very impressed how biomechanics in Brazil has advanced. You are in a field, if you're a student, you're in a field where Brazil is actually recognized as a very strong country in contributing to the international community. And I think that's really exciting. And on a more personal level, I would like to say that, I've been several times in Brazil now, and have been now here for half a year in Florianopolis. And of course, the circumstances are a bit strange with the isolation and so, but I love the people here. I love the place. I think it's a great community. It's a great country to live. And I think there's enormous possibilities for everybody. And thank you again for having me.
Okay, thank you, and good night for everyone. Take care.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.